Ideologies. There's as many of them as there is humans on planet Earth. Every person has a unique set of circumstances that raise them into the person that they are. And the person that they are creates the ideologies that they stand by. And while having a unique ideology is as beautiful and unique as the human that you are, when you start to force your ideologies on other people, problems arise. And that's the real problem with ideologies, is that a lot of people believe that ideologies are just like candy and you can just hand them out to every stranger you bump into. However, more often than not, you look like the man in the van that we were all told to stay away from. But even though people know this, it doesn't stop people from trying to force their ideologies onto each other. And that's as real in fiction as it is in the real world. Wars are started over ideologies so countries can spread what they believe is the correct way of thinking, the correct way of being, the correct way of living. Both villains and good guys in fiction try to spread their ideology as far and wide as possible. Both Naruto and Nagato had ideologies that they wanted to spread with the world. And while in that circumstance, the saying, "the victor writes history," really comes to mind, you, the reader, are supposed to agree with the ideology of the hero. But what happens when somebody doesn't agree with the ideology of the hero? What happens when some people identify with the ideology of the villain? Well, it's not great, but like we said, there's as many ideologies as there is people, and therefore what kind of ideologies we're gonna agree with are gonna change from person to person. And while the overwhelming majority of people agree with Naruto's ideology, there are some people who read Naruto and believe that Nagato was in the right. And in Jujutsu Kaisen, the case is no different. See, ironically in JJK, there's not a lot of heavily opinionated people. Now I know that sounds silly, so let me explain myself. See, the biggest bads in JJK don't really expout their ideologies. They're not standing on a soapbox preaching about how they're gonna make the world a more peaceful place, like Madara or Nagato. The biggest bads in JJK, at least currently in the manga, are Kenjaku and Sukuna, who are kind of just evil for evil's sake. They are cursed spirits, after all. Well, that's kind of an iffy statement in Kenjaku's situation, but still. But this doesn't mean that there's not opinionated people who try to expout their ideologies from a soapbox. However, those people just don't happen to be the big bads of JJK. I mean, they kind of do, but once again, we'll get there. Really, because when you think about opinionated people in JJK, really only one name should come to mind: Geto. Geto is not only one of the more beautifully complex characters in JJK, he's one of the more beautifully complex characters in manga. Geto starts as a high school student in Jujutsu High, trying his best to protect non-sorcerers because he identifies them as the weakest people in society, those who deserve protection. But eventually, over the duration of the part of the manga that's currently being adapted into the first half of season 2 of JJK, we see Geto's ideologies shift vastly, a full 180, going from a man who believes that the non-sorcerers of the world deserve protection to a man who believes that non-sorcerers need to be destroyed. And because Geto is an incredibly complex and cool character who also is fairly attractive, a fair amount of people have saddled on to his ideology and believed that within the confines of the JJK universe, that he might have been correct, that non-sorcerers should be wiped out in order to save the world. But why do people believe this? Why does Geto believe this? And what are the core fundaments of his belief system? And most importantly, how did this shift in his ideology occur? Well, today I hope to answer all of those questions and more. But first, guys, please, for me, like this video, subscribe to the page, and hit that noti bell. And if you want my ideologies forced upon you, you're gonna wanna go ahead and follow my anime podcast, Otaku's Anonymous, where me and Danny Mata break down everything happened in anime this week, the new season of JJK very much included. It's available on YouTube, Spotify, and Apple Podcasts. So Geto, a character as divisive and complicated as some of the most famous villains in anime and manga ever. The complexity of Geto's character has been compared to the likes of Nagato and Madara and Sosuke Aizen, the kind of villain you can't help but root for, if only just a little bit. But before we dive into the complex ideologies of Geto, we as a fan base have to understand him a little bit better. See, not until we understand the person can we understand where they're coming from. Because sure, we can stand across from somebody and say your ideology is wrong when all we know about them is their ideology. It's not until we begin to understand the person whose ideology we may disagree with that we can begin to realize where they might have come across this ideology in the first place. And Geto is truly the perfect example of this. So let's start this video off in the way that we tend to start these videos off. at the beginning. Though the beginning for Geto is basically what we're currently getting adapted into anime. And for those of you who've already seen episode 1 of JJK season 2, you'll know that Gojo and Geto currently exist on opposite sides of the ideological spectrum that we know them to exist on in the modern day. See, in the incredible basketball scene when Gojo and Geto are passing a basketball to each other with more and more aggression, Geto is espousing the ideology that jujitsu sorcerers, as the strongest people in society, should protect the weak, and that the strongest amongst the jujitsu sorcerers should have their power check as to not overpower the weakest in society. That is to say, Geto is saying power should be controlled and used to protect those who don't have it, while Gojo believes that the strong should not be restricted, and that the weak are at the mercy of the strong. Now, the point of this entire season currently being adapted into the anime is that Gojo and Geto are transporting Riko Amanai, a star plasma vessel, to Tengen. And over the course of the couple of days that they're transporting Riko Amanai to Tengen, Gojo and Geto get kind of close to her. They identify why she's so spunky even though she's technically about to merge with an immortal being, effectively losing any semblance of herself. They relax on beaches in Okinawa, they take flights across the country, and more than anything, Gojo and Geto try to protect Riko Amanai from those who would want her dead, because people like the Time Vessel Association want Riko Amanai dead so she can't fuse with Tengen, as anybody fusing with Tengen would impurify Tengen, and the Time Vessel Association views an unsullied Tengen as an object of worship. Now, without spoiling exactly what's going to happen in this season, let's just say that while Gojo and Geto are transporting Riko to Tengen, they see the true darkness of the world. Two children who have never really had much of an issue, as they've always been incredibly strong, being two of the youngest special grade sorcerers in history, are not only pushed to the brink of their power, but pushed to the brink of their emotional capacity. And all of this is at the hands of non-sorcerers. And as Gojo and Geto are pushed to the brink of their emotional capacity, they see the darkness in the lambs that they've been protecting. They see that these non-sorcerers that they believed to be weak weren't truly as weak as they once believed they were. In fact, upon coming toe-to-toe with the sheer might of the collective power of these non-sorcerers, they come to a conclusion that it was never the non-sorcerers who were weak, but the sorcerers. Now, obviously, this realization that the non-sorcerers truly holds the power in the world over the sorcerers comes at the same time as the realization that these non-sorcerers can also be evil. And this darkness begins to take a hold in Geto. But that's an incredibly SparkNotes version of what happened. So let's take a little bit of a deeper dive into that. See, Geto starts out self-righteous, a man who believes that his power was granted to him so he could do incredible good protecting the weak. However, Geto goes from self-righteous to genocidal. And while some would say that these two versions of Geto are two separate people, they're not, because both of these versions of Geto are motivated by the same thing. See, the key fundament to understanding Geto as a person is understanding that his only desire on Earth is to protect the weak. And that never changes. All that changes to Geto is who he believes is weak. Who Geto believes needs his power to protect them. And that is what happens in this current season of anime. See, like we've already stated, in the early days of Geto's high school years, he believed that non-sorcerers were the weak. And honestly, that makes sense. Jujitsu sorcerers have the ability to see cursed spirits that non-sorcerers can't see, but can be killed by. Outside of that, jujitsu sorcerers also have things like innate techniques and domain expansions. They can make their bodies faster and stronger. When it comes down to it, jujitsu sorcerers are in fact stronger than non-sorcerers. And because sorcerers were so much more powerful than non-sorcerers, sorcerers needed to be kept in check. They needed to make sure that their power would never put non-sorcerers in danger. And quite honestly, the Jujitsu Society also agrees with this. It's why before any Jujitsu sorcerer goes off and does Jujitsu sorcery, they have to set up a veil. One, so non-sorcerers don't just wander into the site of an active Jujitsu battle. And two, so the knowledge that cursed spirits exist does not become public knowledge. Because the more people who understand that cursed spirits exist, the more people who fear cursed spirits, and then more cursed energy is released. So Geto is not alone in the ideology that Jujitsu sorcerers are the strong and non-sorcerers are the weak. But over the course of time, Geto starts to realize that Jujitsu sorcerers are the weak. See, one, not only is there way more non-sorcerers than sorcerers, giving them a massive numbers advantage, those who are able to use Jujitsu are forced into a certain kind of life. You go to a Jujitsu high, you become a Jujitsu sorcerer, and then you commit the rest of your life to taking out cursed spirits. So in essence, because you have a certain kind of ability, you're shoehorned into a dangerous profession, protecting people who can't see what you're doing and will never find out what you're doing for them. In fact, that's built into the very society that you're joining. You can and will never divulge what you do or how it's done to the people you're protecting. You are to be a silent, unseen army that gives up its life for people you don't even know. And while that's fine, people do that every single day. The CIA, the FBI, undercover agents, even large swaths of the military. Very few people ever get the recognition for the service they provide for making sure those who aren't in the service get protection. However, so long as that service contributes to the greater good, most people are okay with that. However, the difference between the real world and the JJK world is that no jujitsu sorcerer will ever hold nearly as much power as the non-sorcerers do. Like I've already stated, they're forced into living a life of somewhat secrecy, and therefore no jujitsu sorcerer will ever become a politician or a huge CEO to a company. I mean, they might, maybe, honestly, Nanami was a salaryman, but by and large, that's not gonna happen. And thus, over the duration of this backstory of Gojo and Geto, Geto begins to make these realizations. He begins to realize that jujitsu sorcerers suffer in silence for people who have more power than them. That jujitsu sorcerers are forced into a dangerous lifestyle by people who are cruel and hold the power of a nation over their head. In essence, jujitsu sorcerers are like Atlas holding up the globe, while humans just get to exist on the globe, and at any moment could kill Atlas without knowing that it would destroy the world. And it's upon making these realizations that Geto realized that the non-sorcerers were not the weak, and therefore didn't need his protection. Not only did they not need his protection, they were cruel and needed to be wiped out, because the presence of this numerically superior force that holds all of the power in the world is what's making the Jujutsu Society struggle in vain with no thanks. And it's not until this numerically superior force is eradicated that the weak will ever truly be free. See, rather than seeing cursed spirits as the entity that could wipe out the weak non-sorcerers, Geto began to realize that non-sorcerers were the cursed spirits that could one day wipe out jujitsu sorcerers. And unfortunately, he wasn't necessarily alone in this ideology. See, Geto has always been obsessed with the idea of ridding the world of cursed energy. See, because with no more cursed energy, there's no more cursed spirits. However, there's only a couple of ways that you could ever wipe out cursed energy. In fact, there's really only two ways, and one is substantially harder than the other. See, the first way to wipe out cursed energy from the world is to teach all non-sorcerers heavenly restriction. See, heavenly restriction is a cursed restriction that affects the cursed energy in somebody's body. And this change in your cursed energy can either greatly improve the strength of your body or impose massive limitations onto it. See, heavenly restriction is described as bindings placed on a jujutsu sorcerer at the time of their birth. And these bindings kind of work in two directions. See, those born with low amounts of cursed energy can be given incredibly strong bodies. And this is the case for Maki and Toji. See, Toji was born with no cursed energy, but in exchange for being born with no cursed energy, was given an incredibly physically gifted body. Maki was born with a little bit of cursed energy, and therefore she existed between the realm of being somebody who uses cursed energy and somebody who is strong. However, when she decided to give up the rest of her cursed energy, she was able to achieve the level of strength that Toji wielded. On the opposite end of the spectrum is Kokichi Muta, also known as Mekamaru, who was born with an incredibly frail body, missing entire limbs and not being able to go outside. But because of this, he was granted an insane amount of cursed energy. Now, obviously, Mekamaru isn't the example for what you want humans to undergo. One, it would physically cripple the entirety of the world, and two, everybody would have a ton of cursed energy. And if they didn't become jujutsu sorcerers, they would just be leaking way more cursed energy than usual. What you technically want is the Maki Toji route. You want the entirety of humanity to give up all of their cursed energy in exchange for physically strong bodies. However, unfortunately, undergoing heavenly restriction in that capacity is incredibly difficult. And therefore, the idea of everybody on Earth pulling that off it's infinitesimal. However, those who undergo heavenly restriction aren't the only people who don't emit cursed energy, as jujutsu sorcerers also do not emit cursed energy, which means technically if the entire world were jujutsu sorcerers, there would be no more cursed spirits. However, unfortunately, that is also a very tough ask, because some people are simply just not born with the cursed energy to become a jujutsu sorcerer. So going that route also has an infinitesimal rate of success. So if you can't go the heavenly restriction route and you can't make the entire world jujutsu sorcerers, what do? Well, you do what Geto wants to do. At least that's one of the options. And what Geto wants to do, at least by the time of JJK Chapter 0, is kill every single non-sorcerer on Earth. And the thing about Geto's idea is that technically it wouldn't result in every single person who's currently not a jujutsu sorcerer dying, as many people, if not millions of people in the ensuing chaos, would awaken to jujutsu sorcery powers. As we know, people can awaken to their cursed energy when threatened with death. And therefore, Geto's plan is kind of twofold. Kill everybody who's a non-sorcerer, and those who awaken to being sorcerers get to stick around and get trained as sorcerers. So in summation, a eugenics-based genocide, with the greater good in mind. Now, Geto technically didn't come to this idea by himself. In fact, about halfway through the Gojo and Geto arc, Geto meets with a woman by the name of Yuki, the only other person that we know of on Earth who at that moment had a special grade ranking. Yuki is incredibly powerful. However, she's not associated with JJK High, and thus doesn't really expout all of the ideologies of JJK High. And therefore, she is the person who tells Geto that jujutsu sorcerers don't emit cursed energy. Well, at least the cursed energy that they emit is way less than a non-sorcerer. However, while they're talking about this, it is Geto who says, then why don't we kill all non-sorcerers? Which Yuki compares to forced evolution, like how birds learn to fly, using fear and danger as a catalyst to force human society into the jujutsu society. It may be that the entirety of humanity wouldn't have to be killed if there was enough danger present to motivate them to become jujutsu sorcerers. However, Yuki states that she's not crazy enough to undergo something like this, and tells Geto to identify whether or not he truly believes protecting non-sorcerers or protecting sorcerers is what he wants to do with the rest of his life. However, unfortunately, in a gambit of really bad timing, pretty much directly after this conversation that Geto has with Yuki, he's called to a village to exorcise some cursed spirits. However, upon getting to this village, it's revealed to Geto that the cursed spirits were actually just two young children who were cursed technique users. And because these two children didn't know that they shouldn't tell the people around them about their cursed techniques, everybody in the village made the assumption that they were demons, cursed spirits that were here to cast ill will upon the entire village. And thus these children were abused and thrown away in a cage. And in that moment, once again, Geto was reminded of the power of the non-sorcerer. Here were two literal cursed technique users cast into a cage and abused because of a misunderstanding. Even in circumstances when jujutsu sorcerers become apparent to non-sorcerers, they are treated with fear and prejudice, labeled as witches or curses themselves. And thus, in that moment, Geto was affirmed. This, on a completely micro scale, was a representation of what Geto feared would happen to jujutsu society should non-sorcerers find out about it. It affirmed to him who the truly weak were. And thus Geto, instead of exorcising the two cursed spirits, proceeds to kill 112 people in the village, starting Geto down the path that would eventually lead to his death. So now that we understand what makes Geto tick, was he correct? Now that we understand how he arrived to his ideology, do we sympathize with said ideology? Well, fortunately for us, or maybe unfortunately for us, the archetype of Geto's ideology is something we've seen before, in both the real worlds and in fiction. See, though some people may refuse to see the connection here, the closest possible connection we have to Geto in fiction is Eren Yeager. In fact, Eren and Geto might as well be the same character. Both started out on the side of what many would identify as the correct side of history, fighting the good fight to protect the weak, with Eren joining the Scout Corps to defeat the Titans to protect those within the walls, and Geto joining Jujutsu Hide to battle against cursed spirits and save non-sorcerers. However, as more information became apparent to both of them, they both had an ideological switch. See, as Eren realized that the world outside of the walls was much larger than he ever could have dreamed, he began to realize that the real villains weren't the Titans, but the people who put them there on that island. And as Geto realized that non-sorcerers held plenty of power, he realized that society may at some point suppress those who he believed to be strongest. And that is the exact case in Attack on Titan. The citizens of Paradise Island are way stronger than your average humans. They at any point can be turned into a Titan through the power of the founding Titan. And this Titan can be hundreds of feet tall and crush cities under its feet. It can swat blimps out of the sky, pick up tanks, and hurl them into other tanks. However, this strong minority was being oppressed by the weak majority. And thus, in order to ensure the survival of the strong minority, Eren decides to kill the weak majority. And Geto is exactly the same. Geto, with fear in his heart that one day the non-sorcerer society would kick down the doors of the Jujutsu Society and wipe them all out, decided to take the war into his own hands, to wipe them out before they have the chance to wipe us out. With the only difference between the two being that no war had been openly waged prior. While one could absolutely say that the non-sorcerer society had forced the Jujutsu Society into the kind of lives they were currently living, as anytime the Jujutsu Society became apparent to non-sorcerers, they were met with fear and animosity, which is only further backed up by Geto's first mission after talking to Yuki. There had never been an open war waged between non-sorcerers and sorcerers. Sorcerers simply decided it was best to operate in the shadows. One, for the protection of non-sorcerers, and two, to make sure that less cursed spirits are created. And while I don't agree with Eren's ideology at all, genocide is always bad, the conversation revolving around Eren is slightly more interesting, because unlike the Jujutsu Society, subjects of Ymir were forced to live on Paradise Island, and there was an actual concrete looming threat that one day war would be brought to that island, while the war on Jujutsu Society is more emotional, it's metaphysical. And thus, even though the ideologies and the situations are similar, I can't believe I'm saying this, but Eren is slightly more justified in his genocide. However, in both circumstances, if the weak majority was eliminated, there would be no more need for the societies, be those the subject of Ymir or the Jujutsu Society, to live in secrecy. They could live openly and with acceptance on a worldwide basis. So while the goals of both genocides are technically the same, the motivation is slightly different, as once again, Eren's rumbling is in the face of actual concrete danger, while Geto's is in the face of prejudice. But here's the fun thing. Neither of them are correct. While Geto identified what would be the easiest way to get rid of cursed energy, he'd never tried any of the other ways to get rid of cursed energy. If Geto was truly passionate about trying to rid the world of cursed spirits, he would try some of these more difficult techniques. The first step in any of this would be making the world aware that cursed spirits exist and that individuals wield cursed energy. By trying to spread information and knowledge on these topics and making the idea of Jujutsu sorcery commonplace, we could not only possibly try and teach the world heavenly restriction, but also possibly try and awaken more people to Jujutsu. Now, I know what you're saying. Now, wouldn't this garner more fear on a worldwide basis? Maybe. But there's also the possibility that if the entire world knew that having fear about a subject could create powerful entities that could actually kill people, people could try and change their ways in fear less. On top of this, Jujutsu sorcerers would be able to move openly, operating as a publicly seen police force, assuring the world and local communities that they're there to help. And let's say, hypothetically, the heavenly restriction route doesn't work. At least not with everybody. If just a couple of thousand people are able to figure out heavenly restriction, that is still technically way less cursed energy being pumped out into the world. And if we want people to awaken to sorcery by using fear and danger as a catalyst, what if instead of massacring innocent civilians, we use the fear of the fact that they're creating cursed spirits as the fear catalyst? Imagine you were told that your fear of tsunamis is creating massive ghosts that are somewhat impossible to kill. And those ghosts don't just creak doors or tip over plates, they rip you asunder. Yeah, I think that would motivate me to try and learn sorcery. If we can use fear and danger as a catalyst as it pertains to a genocide, why can't we use fear and danger as a catalyst as it pertains to cursed spirits? Knowledge is truly the most important thing here, and knowledge won't change the role of Jujutsu sorcerers in human society. It will simply just mean that they will operate in the open. Now, will Jujutsu sorcery probably be weaponized by non-sorcerers in the very similar way to the Time Vessel Association using Toji Fushiguro to enact their will? Probably. But mind you, we're talking about the eradication of cursed spirits here. That is at least what Geto says his true motivation is. Well, but I would actually against them. I don't think that Geto wants to wipe out all non-sorcerers in order to make sure that cursed spirits are no longer created. I think Geto wants to wipe out all non-sorcerers to make sure that jujitsu sorcerers are never threatened. Why would a man who wants to wipe out all non-sorcerers even care that cursed spirits would still be around? Yeah, sure, some comrades are killed by cursed spirits, but way more non-sorcerers are killed by cursed spirits. Jujitsu sorcerers have the means to battle back against cursed spirits. So if there's two things that are threatening jujitsu sorcerers in Geto's mind, it's cursed spirits and non-sorcerers. And thus I believe that Geto's intentions are twofold. Not simply to eliminate all cursed spirits, but all threats to jujitsu sorcerers. And that's still genocide. Which, ladies and gentlemen, is never the right choice. It's not a hard concept. Beat it into your skull if you have to. But yeah, that's it. Was Geto correct? The answer is no. There's a reason he was the villain. A complex, cool, well-written villain, absolutely, but in the wrong. But what do you guys think? Do you believe that Geto was in the wrong? Tell me in the comments below. And while you guys are down there, please, for me, like this video, subscribe to the page, hit that noti bell. Now, speaking of being in the wrong, I'm gonna go watch The Witcher.